It's 10:30 in the morning here in Tokyo, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tokyo College online public lecture on increasing water supply through desalination. And my name is Mino. I'm Deputy Director of Tokyo College. And it's a great pleasure for me to serve as moderator for this very interesting session. Today's topic is related to water supply. And of course, water is essential for everybody. It is important for sustainable development of our community. However, we are having water scarcity in different parts of the world because of different reasons. And in order to meet these needs, different needs, we have developed various technologies for water supply. Desalination is one of these technologies. It's sophisticated technologies, it's promising. However, it's expensive and energy consuming. So when we try to apply this desalination technology for water supply, the question is how to balance the necessity for water supply and some other conditions. So today we will focus on desalination, especially the sustainability aspect, the energy aspect of desalination. Today, we have Dr. Alberto Tilafelli, who is Associate Professor at Politecnico di Torino. This is an engineering school located in Torino, Italy, and he is, of course, an expert in desalination. He is currently visiting scholar at Tokyo College. Today, he will focus on the challenges and opportunities of desalination when it is combined with renewable energy. After the lecture, we invite Dr. Kiyo, who is Associate Professor at the University of Tokyo, as commentator. Then, after the conversation between the two, we will pick up a few questions from the audience, if there are any, and if we still have time. And in that respect, please send your questions through the question function of the webinar. Okay, without any further ado, I would like to invite today's speaker, Dr. Tilafelli. So are you ready, Alberto?
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. First, before starting, let me just thank Tokyo College and the University of Tokyo for inviting me here, and my colleagues in the Urban Engineering Department, Takizawa Sensei Lab, and Tokyo College again for the opportunity to speak today and give you a little bit of info about what's going on in the world of desalination, especially from the technology point of view. I'm a technologist, so I'm used to showing some numbers and charts and graphs during my presentations. So I will do that today, but I will try to go through all these numbers, even for those of you who are not used to interpreting graphs and charts. I will start with a brief introduction, framing the problem. As Mino Sensei mentioned, water supply is becoming increasingly complex, and there are many figures and numbers we can cite to prove this statement. But today I decided to report two sentences from the very recent UN World Water Development Report. One quotation cites, "The global urban population facing water scarcity is projected to increase from 1/3 of global urban population to nearly half of global urban population by 2050. The other recites, according to the World Bank, water scarcity exacerbated by climate change could cost some regions up to 6% of their GDP by 2050 due to water-related impacts on agriculture, health and incomes, potentially spurring migration and even conflict." And in fact, we know that some conflicts have already started due to competition around water resources. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see a map with the projection of water-stressed countries by 2040. And just as examples, Italy, which is my country, is projected to be a country with high water stress by 2040, and Japan is projected to be a country with medium to high water stress. We need a lot of water to make sure that society functions well. Actually, in the world, we need an average of 1,200 liters of fresh water per person per day. These figures are a little higher in Japan and Italy. In Japan, this figure is equal to about 1.7 cubic meter per person per day. And in Italy, 1.5, 1.6 cubic meter per person per day. And not all these waters is used at home. Part of it is used at home for our domestic purposes, like cooking, cleaning ourselves, flushing our toilets, cleaning the house. And this is the blue part of the graph. A fraction is used for industrial purposes. That's the red part of the graph. But the vast majority of fresh water supply is needed to grow the food that we eat every day. And that's the green part of the graph, especially in Japan, where about 70% of the freshwater resources are withdrawn to grow food. Only a very, very small part of it, of this water, of this fresh water, is supplied through desalination. And this is the pie chart that you see on the right-hand side. In Japan and Italy, the vast majority of water comes from already freshwater conventional resources like river water, groundwater, and lake water. So what is the rationale for desalination? There are stressors and forces who make water supply more and more difficult. One is climate change, especially by making precipitation more scarce in certain regions and generally speaking, more unreliable. And also diminishing the snow in the winter, which acts as a storage for fresh water in the warmer months. Growing population and economic development are increasing water demand, and we also have an increasing depletion of the freshwater resources due to human activities, so contamination of the conventional freshwater resources. We have some solutions we can apply to face these challenges. First of all, we should reduce consumption and we should use water more wisely. We should also rationalize the capture, storage, and allocation of conventional freshwater resources, and we should improve infrastructure. However, these three solutions are likely not sufficient to cover all the demand for fresh water worldwide. And what we can do is also tap on unconventional resources, for example, salty resources, such as, for example, seawater and wastewater. So the wastewater that we produce every day when, again, we cook and we clean ourselves in our house. These resources have some salt in it, and we need to remove the salt, desalinate them to be able to use them for all our needs. This makes sense if we look at the fraction of salty water compared to fresh water that we have on Earth. So on the right-hand side, there is a representation of the amount of water on Earth and the fraction of salty water compared to fresh water. Fresh water represents only 3.5% of the total water that we have on Earth, and most of the water is actually in the oceans. This ratio is bound to even increase in the future with climate change as freshwater resources get more depleted and ice storage melts. Also, it makes sense to use abundant seawater if we think that a good fraction of the population lives within 100 kilometers from the coast. And this is represented on the left-hand side of the slide, where you see the fraction of people living close to the coast compared to the fraction of people living away from the coast. About 40% of the people on Earth live within 100 kilometers from the coast. When I speak about desalination to people who are not in the field, sometimes they're surprised that actually desalination is already ongoing today, and some places in the world, some countries already supply fresh water using desalinated seawater. The capacity of desalination, so the cubic meters of fresh water that's supplied through desalination in the world, has increased exponentially in the last 30 years. And you see these figures in this graph. And And we have today about 21,000 operational desalination plants in the world. These desalination plants, however, are mostly small scale. So as I mentioned in the beginning, a negligible fraction of fresh water that we supply to the population comes from desalinated water, especially in Japan and in Italy. There are two technologies, two families of technology that we apply today to desalinate water, not just seawater, but all salty water. These two families are distillation and membrane filtration. Distillation is based on a process that we all know. What we do is we start with a mixture of water and salt, so a salty water. We heat it up, so only water evaporates, salt remaining liquid. And then what we do is we can condense the freshwater vapor to produce liquid fresh water. These technologies have extremely high energy demand. This energy is largely supplied by burning fossil fuels. Only large-scale plants make sense if based on this process, and these technologies are relatively high-tech. Membrane filtration is called reverse osmosis in this case, and what we do is we use a filter, a high-tech filter called a membrane, through which we squeeze the salty water. Membrane is able to let only fresh water pass and retains all the salt on the so-called feed side. So on the other side of this membrane, we can collect the high-quality fresh water. Reverse osmosis is a technology with medium to high energy demand. It needs electricity to function. It's high-tech, and it's a little bit more flexible in terms of size compared to distillation technologies. These two families of technologies have some challenges. And I will start mentioning that because of the energy is mostly supplied through burning of fossil fuels or through nuclear energy, there are carbon emission and environmental impacts of these desalination processes. We also have a problem with land use because being industrial processes, if we decide to build a desalination plant, we take up space and we cannot use this land for other beneficial purposes like ecosystem restoration or for the beneficial use of society. When we speak specifically about seawater desalination, we have potential problems related to intake of seawater from the sea and the ocean, which may be dangerous for marine life. And when we talk about desalination in general, we have potential problems with so-called brine disposal, because one of the waste, the byproduct waste of desalination is a liquid of very, very high salinity that we need to manage and dispose of. And most of the times this is done by discharging this liquid back into the sea, into the ocean. This may be potentially dangerous for marine life and ecosystems. To be honest with you, we do have the technologies already to make sure that intake and brine disposal are safe, but this also costs energy. And energy is definitely the most important challenge for desalination. That's because desalination is a separation process. Every time we have an initial mixture of water and salt, and we want to separate it into fresh water, pure water, and salt. Every time we separate something, this requires an effort. So we see that in everyday life. If we start with a mixture of candies of different colors, and I ask you to separate the candies of the yellow candies from the red candies, from the blue candies, from this mixture, it takes time and patience and energy. It's very easy to mix the candies back into a mixture, but it's very hard to separate them in colors. Also, when we paint and we have pigments, usually we start with primary pigments like cyan, yellow, and magenta. If I ask you to make green, you naturally mix cyan and yellow together to create the green color. Now I can ask you, starting from this green color, to separate the pigments again and to recreate the blue, the cyan, and the yellow pigments. This can be done ideally, but you understand it's very, very difficult. So desalination, like these processes that we see in everyday life, is energy intensive. And the energy of desalination is represented in this graph compared to the energy that's required to produce high quality water starting from conventional freshwater resources. So if you want to supply water starting from surface water like lakes and rivers or groundwater, the energy demand is very, very small. It's the line that you see on the left-hand side of the graph. So it's lower than 1 kilowatt-hour per cubic meters of product water. When we want to produce high-quality fresh water starting from seawater, the energy is represented by the blue bar and by the orange bar. The blue bar is associated with reverse osmosis, and the orange bar is associated with distillation technologies. So we use about 10 to 100 times the energy required to produce fresh water starting from conventional resources. Just to give you an idea, 1 kilowatt hours is roughly equal to the energy that I personally spend running for about 45 minutes. Because in reverse osmosis seawater desalination, we need about 5 kilowatt hours each cubic meter of product water. And because we need about 1.5 cubic meters per person per day to produce the water that I need to function well every day, I would have to run for about 6 hours. And that's the energy, the associated to an energy of about 7.5 kilowatts. So you understand this is a lot of energy that we need to make sure that we supply fresh water to make society function and for the well-being of the people. Related to the energy demand, there is the cost of desalination, because most of the cost, as represented in this pie chart, is associated with the energy. This is a pie chart calculated for reverse osmosis seawater desalination, but all desalination technologies and processes and systems pretty much follow this breakdown of costs. So the cost of desalination depends strongly on the cost of energy. For seawater desalination, water cost is typically between 0.7 to $3 each cubic meter of freshwater product. This is equivalent to between 100 and 400 yen. This cost is equal to about 5 to 10 times that of producing freshwater, high quality freshwater, starting from conventional, already freshwater sources. The cost of desalination depends strongly on system size. So the larger the system size, the lower the cost, because larger size systems are more efficient in terms of energy. Also, the cost of desalination increases dramatically, very rapidly, with the extent of salinity, the saltiness of the initial feed that we want to treat. So seawater is a medium salinity feed, and the energy demand is medium to high, but there are other sources that are less salty than seawater that we should also consider when we talk about desalination. One of them is, again, wastewater, which is a low salinity resource that's very abundant, and we can treat it with the final step of desalination to produce water with sufficient high quality for beneficial purposes. These are some examples of desalination as it is applied today and the different costs associated with this different implementation of desalination. So, for example, in California and Arizona, what they do is they take wastewater, which again is a low salinity resource, and they desalinate it. And then what do they do with the product water? They create these pools that you may see in this picture on the right-hand side in the middle of the desert. And so water can percolate into the aquifer, and in this way they replenish the depleted aquifer that they can use as a new freshwater resource. This costs not a lot because desalination of wastewater is relatively cheap. In Singapore, this is another example. What they do is they still take wastewater and they desalinate it. Then they take the product water of this desalination process, they mix it with conventional sources like groundwater and river water, and then this mixture undergoes some other treatment and for indirect potable purposes. So they produce actually drinking water that they bottle up and they sell in supermarket. This is called Desalination. And this costs a little bit more because the quality of the final water needs to be higher because it needs to be drinking water. In Israel, this is another example. They desalinate seawater and they mix it with treated wastewater for irrigation purposes. This costs a little bit more because seawater is a higher salinity source. So to remove salt from seawater takes a little bit more energy and cost than removing salt from wastewater. Even more costly is to desalinate seawater for direct potable purposes, because the quality of the final product needs to be very high. And this is what also they do in Israel. Now, I told you about some of the challenges that we face when we want to implement desalination technologies. And now I want to speak about some opportunities and how we can implement desalination, in my opinion. This graph is a bit difficult to interpret, but I will try to go through it quickly. So the main idea is that current desalination technologies, represented in red here, need high exergy or non-sustainable, let's say, energy to function. And this energy is in the form of high temperature streams, or mechanical energy or electricity. So again, current desalination technologies require unsustainable energy to function. However, myself and colleagues and other groups in the world are researching and developing future desalination technologies who will be able to function on low exergy, or if you wish, sustainable energy, that is mostly in the form of low temperature streams. What are these low temperature streams that we can use? These renewable energy streams, sustainable energy streams. First, of course, solar energy. So we can tap on the sun to drive these future emerging desalination technologies. But we can also tap on geothermal heat. So the heat that's buried underground under liquid or vapor form. Another very interesting energy source is so-called waste heat. Many industries, as a byproduct of their manufacturing process, have a stream that can be liquid or vapor of medium to high temperature, usually between 60 and 120 degrees Celsius. And what they do today, because they cannot use this stream any longer for their manufacturing purpose, they just discharge it into the environment. One example is you see in cooling from using cooling towers, as you see in the picture on the right-hand side. Now, this doesn't make much sense. So we should be able to tap on this stream because it contains a lot of energy. It contains it's medium to high temperature. Unfortunately, we cannot use this stream to run the current desalination technologies, but we will be able to use it to run future desalination technologies. And this waste heat stream is free. So instead of putting it back into the environment, we can use it for free, just using heat exchangers. So we can extract the heat from this stream to use it for desalination purposes. Solar energy in particular makes sense, because if you see at this map of the solar global irradiation, the places in the world where the sun irradiates the most almost perfectly overlap with the parts of the world that will be more water stressed in the future. You may not remember the first world map that I showed you during this presentation, but the red part of this graph almost overlap nicely with the red parts of that graph. So which means that where the water is more scarce, we also have more sun that we can use to run desalination systems. Today, I do not have time to go through all these desalination technologies that we are developing, but I would like to mention some of the names. One of these technologies is called membrane distillation, and it's exactly what the name suggests, is a hybrid of a distillation technology with a membrane-based technology. So what the two families that I talked about in the beginning of this presentation. If these two processes are hybridized in a smart way, then we can sustainably desalinate water using membrane distillation. Another version of this technology is called osmotic membrane distillation. We don't need a membrane necessarily to separate water from salt. So other version of evaporative technologies are called interfacial evaporation and solar stills. In solar stills, of course, you use the sun to drive desalination. We can also use water sorbents. These are materials that can suck up fresh water from a mixture of water and salt, and then we can re-release fresh water from these sorbents to produce our high quality final product, freshwater product. And we can also harvest humidity from the atmosphere using a thermodynamic cycle that's driven by renewable energy. Just to give you an example of the work that the amount of work that's being done these days, on the right-hand side, I just put down some numbers of the number of publications from universities that are being published on the specific technology of membrane distillation in the last 20 years. And you see that the number of research is increasing very, very rapidly. I also want to mention one possible version of some of these technologies, one possible design of these technologies that we call passive design. So this cannot be done with current technologies of desalination, but it can be done with some of the technologies that I just mentioned, design them and implement them as passive, in a passive version. So what is passive? I'm going to read the definition in the slide. A passive technology is a small, standalone, and self-operating system characterized by inexpensive and widely available materials and parts, and by easily maintainable components where all processes occur without mechanical moving parts. So it's a version of a technology that's not high-tech, it's low-tech, and it's self-operating. It operates by itself, and if it breaks down somehow, it's very easy to fix with very cheap materials. One passive technologies that Japanese people are very familiar with is shishidoshi. So actually, this is not to make water. No, this is to keep animals away from farms by making a sound, a tapping sound, and it uses water to run. But as you understand, it's a very smart, easy technology made of cheap materials that operates by itself. And so this is just an example of what we can do with the future emerging technologies, making them, design them in a way that's very, very intuitive and cheap and easy to maintain. I just want to make one disclaimer before proceeding, which is that these future technologies will likely only be implemented at small to medium scale. And this, if you remember what I said earlier, that the cost of desalination increases with if we make these technologies at small scale, it seems a contradiction because it seems that future technology would be more costly. However, because of the cost of desalination is related to the type of energy that we need, because the energy that we need is sustainable, the actual cost will be low, especially as renewable energy becomes cheaper and cheaper. So in this graph, I'm showing you the numbers of this disclaimer that I'm making. So on the left-hand side of this, the three bars represent the total amount of energy we actually need for desalination using different technologies. The blue pattern bar is the energy that we need with emerging technology, which is higher, actually. The total energy is higher than what we need with current technologies in red and pink. However, the non-renewable fraction of this energy is much larger in these future technologies for desalination. All the energy that we need in current technology is non-renewable, but most of the energy that we will need in these future technologies will be renewable. So the costs will drop, the cost of desalination using these future technologies. Now, in the last 10 to 15 minutes of this presentation, I would like to give you an idea of how we can implement desalination, in my opinion, in a rational way. So let's suppose that in a certain nation or in a certain location, the total amount of high quality fresh water needed to support societal well-being is represented by the rectangle on the right-hand side, the white rectangle. And on the left side rectangle, the blue one, we have all the available feasibly usable freshwater resources in this location. So the amount of river water, groundwater, lake water that we can feasibly use. So because in this case, the amount of available freshwater resources is much larger than the needed amount of fresh water supply, then we are good, we don't have a problem, and we can cover the entire amount using freshwater resources. And in this case, we do not need to implement desalination. This is the case, I would say, for most of Japan, and because Japan has a lot of, has abundant freshwater resources, at least in most of the year. There are locations or instances in which the amount of water that needs to be supplied is much larger than the amount of the available freshwater resources. So we cannot cover the total demand using freshwater resources. And this is also the situation, situation that may occur in locations where typically we have a lot of freshwater resources like Japan, but in some months of the year, we actually cannot feasibly use them. So for example, in the summer. So in this case, we have a problem because we cannot cover the entire demand by using freshwater resources. So what can we do to face this, tackle this issue? First of all, as I mentioned in the beginning, we should reduce consumption, need, and withdrawal. So decreasing the area of this white rectangle. But this is not likely to solve the problem. Another solution is, as I mentioned also in the beginning, is to improve the current management of freshwater resources. So trying to meet the demand using this approach. This is, again, probably not likely to solve the problem everywhere or every time. Enters desalination. So with desalination, we can increase the amount of water that we can supply under certain circumstances in certain locations and cover the entire demand of high quality water. So desalination may help alleviate the burden on fresh, noble water resources and facilitate their management and allocation. Of course, as I mentioned, at the expense of higher costs and energy supply. However, these costs and energy demands will be supplied in the future using more and more renewable energy, driving the cost and down and the sustainability of these technologies high. Also, and I would argue that although desalination is a bit more costly, it maybe reflects a little better the actual value of water. Water tends to be a little bit too cheap. And so the cost of desalination actually, as I mentioned, reflects a little bit better what the actual value of water is. Just to close, another example of how we can implement desalination in a rational way. So in this slide, what we have is a square that again represents the total amount of water that needs to be supplied in a certain location or in a certain nation to support societal well-being. In this location or in this nation, we have many diverse water needs. So not all water is needed for the same purpose. Some water is needed for potable purposes. Some water is needed for agricultural purposes. And even within agriculture and irrigation, water of different quality is needed for different crops. Also, some water is needed, for example, for toilet flushing, for industrial purposes. There are many, many different water needs, and each of them requires a certain quality of water. So this is one dimension of this matrix. The other dimension of the matrix is represented in this slide by the conditions. So the conditions may be different in terms of geography, hydrology, climate, culture, and economy. So for example, in some places in the nation, we may have a lot of sun, some places may be remote, some places may have large availability of freshwater resources. And this is the other dimension of this matrix. So there are many, many different combinations because we want to produce potable water in certain locations where, for example, there's a lot of sun, or we want to produce irrigation water in some locations where there's a lot of availability of freshwater resources. So the combinations are a lot, and the combinations are represented by the small squares that make up for the total, the larger square, the total water demand. So we need to decide what part of this square needs to be covered by desalination. It doesn't make sense to cover the entire square, but some of these combinations, and these are just examples, I'm not I don't want to mean that some of this what the writing in this slide is these are just examples. So it's only a qualitative representation of what I want to come across. So some of this demand should and can be covered by desalination. This is not so. This is good because this helps us alleviate the burden of freshwater resources. But we can do even a further step. With future desalination technologies, given their flexibility, we can also design them in different ways that make sense for this specific combination. So we don't just cover some of the water demand by desalination, but we also have different shades of desalination. For example, in some cases, it may make sense to implement desalination like we're doing today, using large-scale centralized electricity-driven desalination. In some cases, and combinations, it may make more sense to implement desalination at small scale using decentralized passive systems. In some cases, again, just as examples, it might make sense to use waste heat because we have it available under certain conditions and build medium-scale desalination. Or we can use medium-scale plants where we hybridize the energy supply using a mixture of electricity with solar thermal energy. And this is done because this can be done because, again, we are developing as technologists technologies that can be implemented in different ways. So to summarize what we talked about today, obtaining high quality water from salty water, so desalination, is relatively expensive. And unfortunately, it will always be relatively expensive because the energy required for desalination is always going to be higher than the energy required to produce high quality water from freshwater resources. This is something we cannot escape in this universe, at least, because of some thermodynamics reason. Emerging technologies of desalination that we are developing, they trade efficiency with sustainability. So they are actually a little bit less efficient than current technologies of desalination, but they're much more sustainable because we can tap on renewable energy to drive them. We need to remember that every condition is unique and there is no universal one-size-fits-all solution for water supply. So desalination is just one of the solutions that we need to implement within a portfolio of solutions to increase freshwater supply sustainably. Luckily, emerging technologies that are being developed may be tailored for different purposes, and this flexibility will help a lot in implementing desalination rationally. Of course, a lot of research and technology transfer is still needed to get to that point. And as I mentioned, desalination is just a technological solution. So what we do is what I like to think that I do every day in my work is to provide the weapons, the means that can be used and chosen by politicians to make sure that fresh water is supplied sustainably. However, these are just means. And the water supply, water management is a much larger problem. So a wise and forward-looking attitude is also needed in terms of management for water and water resources. And I'm going to read the last sentence in this slide just to be thorough. Desalination can help alleviate the issues of natural freshwater availability and allocation by enlarging the pool of water sources that can be used to produce fresh water, but a more rational grand management strategy is required around water supply, and this requires better politics, better policies, and also, I would argue, a change in the culture around the water. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Alberto. Actually, you covered quite diverse and comprehensive aspect of the current situation of water scarcity, as well as the coping technology. I really appreciate your input. Now, I would like to invite today's commentator, Dr. Kurisu Kiyo. She's associate professor at Department of Urban Engineering, the University of Tokyo. And Kiyo is taking socio-psychological approaches to environmental problems and focuses on factors affecting people's pro-environmental behavior. And I would expect that Kiyo could pick up various aspects of desalination when it is combined with renewable energy. So now I think you are ready to respond to the lecture by Alberto, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mino. So also thank you for Alberto, the very valuable talk about desalination technology. So I'd like to provide some comments for his talk. So here I'd like to show overall comment for his talk. So seawater or wastewater desalination can be said to be a technology of great hope for areas where water is scarce. However, as already Alberto mentioned, the problem is the large amount of the energy consumed during operation. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions, such as CO2, and life cycle associated with seawater desalination come from energy consumption during the operation stage. I'd like to show one example in Japanese case in next slide. So if this can be covered by renewable energy, it will become a very promising technology. So here you can see the one research outcome from the group of the Professor Itsubo. He's a specialist about life cycle assessment, calculating total environmental burden associated with technology or product or policy or measures like that. So you can see in this graph that this graph shows the life cycle CO2 emissions, and the right-hand side is water consumption. So I'd like to just show the CO2 emission part and per 1 cubic meter water production. And this marker and the line shows the CO2 per 1 cubic meter water production. And the bar graph shows the which stage contribute to the total CO2 emission. And this is the results from the actual desalination plants already operated in Japan, in Fukuoka and Okinawa. So as you can see in these bar graphs, most part of CO2 comes from operational stage. So most part is this operational stage. And also you can see the CO2 emission in Okinawa plant and Fukuoka plant cases. So Okinawa plant shows higher CO2 emission per 1 cubic meter water production. So this higher CO2 emission in Okinawa plant comes from its higher carbon intensity of electricity. Carbon intensity of electricity means how much CO2 is emitted for 1 kilowatt hour electricity is produced. So as you can see in Fukuoka case and Okinawa case shows almost double carbon intensity for electricity. The reason is in the Okinawa's case, the grid power energy, electricity is mainly produced by thermal power generation. On the other hand, in the case of Fukuoka, other electricity, the sources like nuclear or hydro, geothermal are used. So the CO2 emission is a little bit lower comparing with Okinawa. So as I've already said, so if this energy consumption part is covered by renewable energy, so the total greenhouse gas emissions are reduced and this technology becomes more sustainable one. So here I'd like to move on to the discussion points. So I'd like to raise the 3 discussion points here. One is technical challenges for desalination technology. And the second one is key factors for the adoption of desalination technology. And the third one is future potential or limitations of combination with renewable energy. So I'd like to talk a little bit one by one. So first discussion point is technical challenges for desalination technology. So as shown by Alberto, desalination technique has several technical challenges, not only about the energy for operational stage, but also the points shown in these slides. So I'd like to know more how to tackle these issues. So one is possible limitations of passive technology. So some are already talked by Alberto. So that it is small and cheap and to some extent low tech. Maybe it would be small, but is there any possibility to scale up it? And can it get enough flow for covering the needs of the local people? How promising in future? And already talked, it will be cheap, but I'd like to know more. Comparing with other technologies, how about cost? And also in the middle of his presentation, he mentioned about the environmental impacts of effluent, such as brine, very high salinity water, and maybe higher temperature of effluent can also have some impact on marine ecosystems, I think. So he said already some technologies for making safe these problems, these effluent problems. But if you can have some information, so that I'd like to know more the current measures to reduce these impacts on marine ecosystems. And discussion point 2 is key factors for adoption of desalination technology. So as pointed by Alberto, desalination technique is not the best option for all regions. Some combination is needed. So what are the key factors that determine the adoption of desalination technology? So I divided these factors into two parts. One would be geographical conditions, such as climate, other water source potentials, and also seawater availability. And another would be socio-economic conditions. So the economic power for construction and operating desalination. I think the investment cost of desalination is also high, expensive, I think. So I think the local government needs some economic power to invest this technology. And also the water tariff settings and users' ability to pay. And also I'd like to know human ability to maintain this sophisticated technology. And the final discussion point is the future potential or limitations of combination with renewable energy. So I raised the 3 points here. First one is about cost. So currently fossil fuels such as coal and LPG can be cheaper than solar and wind power. So if renewable energy is used for desalination process, the cost may become more expensive. Of course, renewable energy is becoming cheaper and cheaper, so it becomes comparable in near future, but the cost cannot be dramatically reduced, isn't it? So I'd like to show one data from the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, Japan. So they show the power generation cost, not price, but the cost. And the upper graph shows the cost, Japanese yen per kilowatt hour power generation. So these are coal and LPG, sorry, this is LNG and oil. So comparing with these fossil fuels, wind power and solar power is not so cheaper. So in the case of wind, it's still quite more expensive. And still the trend is continuing even in 2030. So I want to know the cost issues. And another point is stability of renewable energy. So major renewable energies such as the solar and wind powers are not stable and influenced by weather conditions. So how much operational energy can be actually covered by renewable energy? In other words, is the 100% coverage technically possible or not? And the final one is which renewable energy is more promising from the viewpoint of the desalination, combination with desalination technology. So various options can exist, such as solar power, offshore, onshore wind power, biomass, and also Alberto mentioned the geothermal, and also nowadays hydrogen is the one quite promising technology, promising the new energy source. So are there any restrictions or better recommendations for matching with the desalination technology? So this is my final point. So thank you, Alberto, again. So, this is very interesting and valuable talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kiyo-san. Actually, the talk by Alberto was very comprehensive, but the comment by Kiyo is further comprehensive, and she touched upon various aspects of desalination. Especially, she picked up 3 technical challenges and the conditions for the usage of desalination and the future aspect of the desalination. So I'm sure that Alberto, you would like to respond to Kiyo?
Yes, thanks very much for your raising all these very, very valid points. There were quite a few, so I'm going to try to go through them relatively efficiently and try to respond as much as possible. So starting from technological challenges, one of the points raised by Kiyo-san was the implementation of passive technologies. How can we scale them up, and where do they make sense? We can scale passive technology up a little bit, but in my opinion, it doesn't make sense to scale them up too much. So they make sense when they are small or relatively small, because only at small to medium, say, or small to medium scale, yes, then they can really be easily maintainable, and they don't need skilled personnel to be operated. Now, so the productivity of passive systems will be low, probably in the order of a few tens of liters per day. There is a threshold below which even this passive technology doesn't make much sense. So below a certain threshold, around maybe 1, 2, 3 liter per hour, I would say, or let's say 5 to 10 liters per day, it doesn't really make sense to produce a technology like that. But we are working to go above this threshold, making these technologies more rational and sensible. Now, so what are the uses, the specific uses for these passive versions of the technologies? I believe they can be used by individual families or by individual small communities. So this is the size that we are talking about. But I think they will be especially interesting under certain circumstances. For example, in remote locations. So that's very interesting in remote locations where for example, electricity is unreliable. Then it would be nice to have a passive technologies that can at least cover the basic human needs for high quality drinking water. And also they make sense for under emergency conditions. So in the case of a major earthquake, say, and where infrastructure is down for some reason, then imagine if every family had in their wardrobe, like a small standalone passive version of design of the technology that they just put outside and does everything by itself. With the sun, it can produce drinking water. Then this would help face some of the challenges that sometimes we face under emergency conditions. So these are, I think, are the circumstances for passive technologies. In terms of brine management, this is, of course, one of the big problems, environmental problems with desalination. As I mentioned, we theoretically, we do have already means to reduce as much as possible the impacts of discharging brine and high salty waste byproduct into the sea. But this, again, in the future is not the way to go. So the way to go in the future is approaching what we call in my field zero liquid discharge. So no longer having a liquid waste at the end of the desalination process, but ending up extracting basically all the water from the initial source and ending up with a waste that is solid or near solid. So basically just the salt. So this cannot be done using, again, current technologies. It requires at least one evaporative or crystallization final step to extract all the water. And it's a bit expensive, but actually the cost can be offset by the fact that we should stop thinking about seawater or other water resources just as a source of water. We should start thinking of them as a source of water and other elements. Because, for example, seawater contains a lot of other valuable elements like lithium or salt itself. So only by extracting all the water and crystallizing the salts, for example, we can not just produce fresh water using salty resources, but we can also extract other valuable resources that are highly needed today to support economic growth and societal well-being. So this is the way to go, is to approach zero liquid discharge and extract other types of resources. Then, what about the cost, the contracting issues and the maintenance issues that you raised? So yes, we need skilled personnel to run desalination plants, and we don't have it right now, to be honest. We need to form personnel, especially for the larger scale plants. And governments, when we talk about large-scale plants, governments need to be involved, right? And contracting issues are very, very important. We have some good examples of how this can be done. Israel is a very good example of how desalination plants, large desalination plants, can be built, making the water cost as cheap as possible. And it has to do with the interaction and collaboration between public and private companies and the right contracting means. However, when we want to implement smaller or medium-scale desalination systems, maybe the government doesn't necessarily need to be involved, right? So, for example, individual industries, what can they do? They face more and more pressure by governments themselves, regulations to manage their wastewater and their freshwater use in a better way. And so many industries are moving towards building inside their manufacturing facilities some medium to small scale desalination plants. And this cost can be, just chipped in by the industry itself, which gains benefit in terms of water management within the processes, and also some gains in terms of environmental visibility, right? That's also another drivers of industry. So I envision that we will have a combination of small, medium, and large scale plants in the future that will be implemented based on different funding and different contracting ways. However, as you mentioned, costs will never go below a certain threshold. So costs will always be above a certain threshold. And this needs to be faced. We need to face the fact that water might become more expensive in the future. As I argued in a slightly provocative way during my presentation, I think water is probably too cheap right now, and it's not as valued economically as it is for our actual needs. We need water to survive and to thrive, and we do not need other things to thrive and survive, but they cost much more than water, right? So the cost of desalination will increase the price of water, but maybe reflecting a little better actually the actual value of water. And what should be done probably, and this is just a suggestion, I'm not a politician and I'm a technologist, but, so I'm thinking about these issues from the outside, but what can be done is making water very, very cheap or even free until a certain threshold to cover all our basic needs. And then above that, water should be increasingly more expensive and rapidly increasingly more expensive. Whatever we use more than what we need, then we should pay for it, I think. And this will probably, or hopefully, cover the cost that will be of desalination, or not just desalination, but the infrastructure, the better infrastructure that we're going to need in terms of water supply. Final points were stability of renewable energy, and this is a technological problem. Yes, because there are fluctuations, right, in renewable energy. If we talk about the sun is shining only some parts of the day. If we talk about production of, say, electricity using wind turbines, if the wind doesn't blow, then the production goes down. So luckily, there are some of the new technologies that we are developing can cope with that a little better than current technologies. So just an example, reverse osmosis, the current technology, one of the most important current technologies for desalination, we cannot turn it off. So once we turn on a plant, it needs to stay on. Because if we turn off the plant, because the energy is missing at some point, then we have a lot of problems with the performance of the membranes and of the system itself. We are working on making sure that some of the future technologies can cope with these fluctuations. And of course, energy storage becomes very important. And energy storage can be thermal storage, and can be other types of storage. And it's becoming cheaper and cheaper, but it needs to be accounted for. And as I also mentioned very briefly in my presentation, the instances in which the total energy demand will be covered 100% by renewable energy will be very few. There will probably always be some fraction of energy that's going to be covered by conventional energy. So we should try to push the fraction and this ratio as much as possible in favor for renewable energy, but it makes sense to use hybridization of the energy. In my opinion, waste heat is very, very promising. So if you ask me what is the most promising energy source, is waste heat, because that's actually continuous. The industrial processes are continuous. They produce waste heat continuously. So we kind of solve the problems of fluctuations using waste heat. And again, if an industry decides to build a medium-scale desalination plants inside their facility, they can just use the waste heat that they're normally discharging into the environment to run that desalination plant. So very, very promising. I hope I addressed most of the points.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. Actually, you are honest enough to say that the water is going to be expensive in the future, but at the same time, you show some promising aspects of desalination. Well, Kiyo-san, would you like to say anything to this? Okay. Actually, there are some questions from the audience, and well, actually, the first two are kind of similar or dealing with similar aspect. The one from Guizani Mokhtar, I think this questioner is from from Saudi Arabia. The question is, using renewable energy for desalination is a good idea, but from practical cases, desalination using renewable energy turned out to be more expensive. In Saudi Arabia, despite the abundance of solar radiation, they face huge challenges using renewable energy. So this is one aspect, the solar energy, solar radiation, some problem there. And the use of waste heat, you just mentioned this, the use of waste heat is also a common practice in the thermal desalination in GCC. What is GCC? Since early days of desalination, because they have cogeneration plants, which uses waste heat from thermal power plants. And can you comment on these, the solar radiation as renewable energy and the thermal power? And the next question is from Dr. Farid at City University. How about using solar PV to generate electricity and use solar-driven RO for energy-efficient water desalination? How would you compare this strategy with other emerging technologies? So they are talking about
Yes.
energy source.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for the questions, very valid questions. Yes, so there are, renewable energies are very expensive today. So it's true that if we decided, let's say today, to implement large-scale desalination plants using renewable energy, this will be very, very, very expensive. However, the price of renewable energy is decreasing very, very rapidly. And it will be cheaper and cheaper in the future, approximating, in my opinion, a cost that will mostly offset some of the challenges that we're facing in that regard. Now, of course, there are conditions where still it won't make sense to implement renewable energy desalination. Saudi Arabia is a very special case, right? Because energy is very cheap in Saudi Arabia. And I'm not sure if we just based the decision on making desalination on implementing desalination using renewable energy, if we just base this decision on costs, then maybe Saudi Arabia, this will never be feasible economically, because the other sources of energy are probably going to be cheaper for still a long time. And so this is what I mean by there is no one-size-fits-all solutions. And but there's many other instances in the world where energy is so expensive that actually renewable energy is already competitive, or it's becoming competitive. When we talk about waste heat, it's true that it's already used in some cases, but what I'm talking about is actually waste heat that cannot be used and is not being used today, because I mentioned in the presentation some numbers regarding the temperatures, and I mentioned 60 to 120 degrees. But actually, what I mean by using waste heat to run desalination technologies, I'm talking about even heat stream at temperatures between 40 and 60 degrees. So these cannot be used today. So these are very low temperature streams, but that cannot be tapped today. But let's say even membrane distillation, just to give an example, 40 degrees, it can be run. Maybe the fluxes, the productivity would be low, but membrane distillation at 60 degrees, a temperature that is basically unfeasible to use today, runs quite well. So yes, waste heat has been used, but there's a large fraction of waste heat that is not being used today, and that's low temperature waste heat that can be used likely in the future. Regarding photovoltaics, so in my presentation, I mostly focused on indirectly, let's say, on thermal-based future technologies of desalination. So waste heat, thermal energy, solar thermal energy, and geothermal heat, right? I didn't really go and talk directly about electrification, so renewable energy to produce electricity. Now, of course, this is another option, an option that we have, because if we can cover the entire energy demand of a using so the electricity demand by renewable energy, then it doesn't matter. We can build a reverse osmosis desalination plant, and it will be run by electricity, and this electricity comes from renewable energy, right? So this is an option. However, I don't think it's feasible to cover the entire demand using renewable energy, especially when we talk about large desalination plants. I'm not sure that we can build a lot of large desalination plants and think that we can actually cover the entire demand of the nation comprising these plants using renewable energy and photovoltaics. If we make a simple calculation of how much area of photovoltaics you need for a desalination plant, you will see that it will take so much land that it's not really feasible. So because land has value, so at some point you will need to decide whether you use this land for photovoltaics or to grow food. There's a certain point above which competition arises between different uses of land. So yes, we should use renewable energy for electricity purposes, very much. But I think the interesting part of this portion of these technologies of desalination are related to thermal processes and thermal desalination. I hope this kind of addresses the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, for me, it was interesting to pick up the issue of waste energy, because my major is sewer systems, and we try to make use of the energy in the wastewater stream or sewer stream, but this is only a few degrees higher than the air temperature. So theoretically, it's possible to use those waste energy, but in reality, from technological point of view, it's quite difficult, and we still need some time to really make use of them. There are I think two additional questions. One is from the same person. Can you cite some examples of passive systems? So if you have any actual example of this passive system, would you please tell us about that? And another question is from David Ludek-Hobicki. I'm sorry, I can't read your name properly, but thank you so much. Roughly, how much more expensive do you think water should be per liter? And secondly, regarding the smallest system you mentioned, where, if any, are these being piloted? Oh, so again, the actual examples. What are the inputs? How much space do they require, and how challenging are they to maintain? So one is the example from passive system, and the other is the price of water and well, actual pilot plants.
Okay, passive systems. So yes, there are examples of passive systems being developed. For example, in one of the slides, I mentioned solar stills. So solar stills are systems that, just to make it, try to make it as understandable as possible, they float on a saline source. So let's say on the sea, they float on a saline source. They are able to concentrate somehow the energy from the sun, and they intake seawater, and evaporation occurs in these systems naturally due to the energy of the sun, and then vapor forms, it condenses at the top, and then water is collected, flows and is collected in some chambers. So there are many different designs of this technology, but this is just one example. And so interfacial evaporation processes, solar stills, are examples of passive systems. And with my colleagues and my colleagues have already developed one prototype of a technology that's similar to that. And we right now currently have a project that has promised to bring this technology to a level or a readiness level that's sufficient to be implemented at quite a large scale, not a large scale in terms of size, but with many, like the possibility to manufacture many of these different systems. And the system again is based on this system floats on a saline source through a capillary action. It sucks up seawater. So there's no moving parts, there's no pumps, there's no mechanical parts. And then this water, the energy of the sun is used to evaporate this water, and then it's collected, and the brine is automatically released back into the ocean in a cycle. So the operator or whoever uses the system should just go there and collect fresh water that's produced by the system once in a while, once the collection chamber say it's full. So that's one example. What about the price of water? Contentious topic. So I don't know what the price of water should be. First of all, it should not just simply be a certain price per liter. Again, it should be like taxation is done in different places. It should be increasing. So maybe even free until a certain point, or very, very cheap, and then increasingly more expensive. But I would not, let's say, if you want a number from me, don't hold me up to that. But if water cost would like double of what it is right now, I wouldn't be surprised, and I wouldn't scream that it's such a bad thing, I would say. So twice doubling the amount, the price would cover a lot of the costs that we will face. Pilot systems. There are pilot systems of technologies that I mentioned that are being run and implemented. So I'm also involved in the construction of some of these demonstrators of membrane distillation right now. But I've seen some already, for example, in Arizona. There are some colleagues who have a couple of pilot plants for membrane distillation run by renewable energy. Space is not such a big problem, in my opinion. Yes, as all industrial systems, they will take some space, but because these systems are run will be implemented, in my opinion, again, at medium scale. I would say that most of the communities and industries have the space available to install such technologies. So the pilots that I have seen, provided they are just pilots, they take the space of a bedroom, typically. Of course, the real systems will take up more space, but it's not a linear thing. So as the system gets larger and larger, the actual amount of space per unit water product, it gets smaller. So yes, the system are going to be larger than that, but they're not going to be extremely large. That's also because the size of the system depends on the productivity. So the larger is the productivity per unit area of a membrane, for example, the smaller will be the plant. And that's what we are working on today as well, to increase the productivity of a system, of the systems, and trying to, in that sense, there's also a threshold below which size and the amount of area of membranes that you need is too high, but above a certain threshold, then the system becomes feasible. And although there are not many calculations in terms of techno-economic feasibilities nowadays, there are a few. I think that this is not the main problem. Let's put it this way. There are other challenges that we mentioned today that are probably more important than space. But stay tuned for more techno-economic assessment, because it will come. It will come more and more in the future, together with the development of the engineering part of this technology. We will have more and more numbers related to the economy and feasibility of these technologies.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I don't find any other questions from the audience. So I will ask you too for the final the comment. But basically, thank you for this very interesting discussion. And the audience may understand that if we just talk about desalination, still there are many different combinations of desalination and the different renewable technology and the different situation, different condition, depending on the location situation. So the discussion is not simple, not same for all the places. And we understand, even though there are many difficulty and complexity, we understand that the desalination is a very promising technology, and it gives some flexibility for the choice of our water supply. So first, may I ask Dr. Chris Kiyo for your final remark?
Yeah, thank you, Alberto. Very interesting talks, including our discussions. So that, as already Professor Mina mentioned, so that I also agree with the desalination technology itself is also the quite promising and the unique and sophisticated technology, but it's related to the various kind of things, the social things and also policy things, and also it include the economic and technical and many things. But considering those quite the different kind of things from the multiple viewpoints, it's quite important, and then quite not only social, not only technical issues, but also social issues. So I quite enjoyed today's talk and discussion. Thank you very much, and also I want to see your future work. Thank you very much.
So Alberto, your final words.
So I think I agree with Mino Sensei that the flexibility is one of the most exciting parts of this work that I'm doing. I think of a future of water supply, water treatment and supply, where we are not gonna only rely on large centralized systems like we have done until today, but where we have a combination of small, medium, decentralized, centralized, large-scale systems, and where we have larger cycles of water, and like we have today, human cycles, I mean, water that is being treated in large plants and supplied, and wastewater released and again treated in large-scale treatment plants. Larger cycles, but within this larger cycle, we have smaller cycles of water, where individual building, communities, neighborhoods will be able to manage their water supply internally and using more and more sustainable technologies. So that's what I envision for the future. And I'm just one small part of this. I just try to provide some technologies to make this possible. And as I mentioned, there is a lot that we need to think about when we think about water. And I also envision a change in the culture around water in the future. Thanks for today's discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Actually, I don't agree. You are not giving. You are giving not small, but really big contribution to this technology. So thank you for joining us today. And with this remark, I would like to close today's session. Thank you very much.